This side good?
You're good.
All right, man.
Hello.
Hello.
So we're here to talk about Cher's new memoir,
All right.
I think, right? I hear you're a big Cher enthusiast.
I am. I like that she sings with so much heart. You know, like I always have one of her songs on my writing playlist.
Yeah. And so you write to music.
I do. Yeah, I can't. Well, I say I can't not write to music, but I just haven't tried. I don't know.
And music with words, you like to sing in?
I do. Okay. I'm like enough of a, I don't know what you call it. Like I'm not culturally informed enough to listen to music without words because it makes me go to sleep, man.
Right. Volume-wise,
Volume-wise, as loud as I can have it without having absolutely permanent hearing damage. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You find that in writing horror, it's nice to not have silence?
You know, it's not about that so much. It's about it's two things, actually. I rig these playlists for all of my novels I write because I never have a lot of time to write. I'm stealing 15 minutes here, an hour there throughout the day. And after 2 or 3 writing sessions with the same playlist, I become conditioned such that when I hear the opening bars or whatever the first song is, I'm immediately dropped into the emotional story space of that novel, and I don't have to warm up. And
right.
The second reason I do music while I write is I think thinking is completely unhelpful for writing. And so if I have Def Leppard or Waylon Jennings or whoever loud enough in my ears, that occupies the critical portion of my brain such that I can actually get work done. Because if every line I'm asking myself, couldn't that be better? What if somebody reads this? Then I'm never going to move forward. But if I just pretend to myself that I'm writing this for a guy I knew when I was 16 who spent 23 hours of every day stoned and he's going to laugh at everything I say, it becomes a lot easier to get words on the page, man.
And so the thinking happens when then?
Thinking comes into play in revision. Thinking is important. I don't want to say thinking's not important, but in revision, you figure out if I pull this lever, that lights up. If I roll this wheel, that turns over there. You've got to think for revision. You've got to think mechanically. But for first drafts, it's all about writing the feelings for me.
And do you have notebooks? Are you outlining? Are you thinking about tomorrow's work at dinner?
I'm never outlining. I am always thinking about tomorrow's work, the next story problem, whatever it is. I used to keep notebooks, little 6x8 spiral bound things, and I would just fill those dudes up. But after a few years, I noticed I had 3 shelves. I probably had 150 notebooks, and I realized I had never once looked back at a single one of those notebooks. So sold them to a library. I don't have any use for them.
And so when you teach students, do you say, do it like I do it, or do you?
No, I say whatever produces the product, aside from slowly stepping on kittens or something, is a good, whatever it takes to get the stuff on the page for you, with your method, with how you are, that's the way to do it. There's somehow the world is subscribed to when a writer comes into an interview in the newspaper and says, I worked on this for 7 years. There's some sort of obligation there that the reader is supposed to say, oh, they worked on it for 7 years. I must read this. They put a lot of work into it. And I don't think that matters at all. If you write it in a weekend, if you write it in 7 years, it's the product that matters, not the process.
Yeah, these things can happen very quickly. Mm-hmm. And in fact, certainly with filmmaking, it's like the most famous scene you can think of. They shot on a Tuesday,
yep.
Right?
Yep.
And they did it in 4 hours, and now it's the iconic, I could have been a contender scene, but it was a moment in time.
Yep.
So.
Yep. The trick is the more you sit there, the more you look into those kind of moments, I think.
Yeah. I read that one of your earliest reading memories was in the grocery store in Midland, Texas.
Yeah. My mom we lived way out in the country, and every 2 weeks on a Wednesday after school, Mom would load us into our Suburban. We'd hike into town, and she would station my brother and I at the magazine rack where we would sit there on our knees and read National Enquirer and all the whatever it was. And she would shop, and it would take her hours to shop. I don't think she was shopping the whole time. I don't know what she was doing, but it was...
The magazine rack was childcare.
Yes, it was. It was. I don't know what was going on. But I really kind of blame National Enquirer for all of my writing and reading taste, because I read National Enquirer cover to cover on those Wednesdays before I was critical of things. You know, I was 10 years old and I was thinking like, oh, Bat Boy? Am I going to see Bat Boy? You know?
Yeah. And so what was the first horror story that you remember reading?
I don't remember the writer, but The Stone Boy. Do y'all know The Stone Boy? It's two kids get up early right before the sun to go pick grapes because when it's still crisp, the little stalks break easier so you can get the grapes off the vine better. And they have a .22 with them so they can plunk a rabbit or something if they see it. And going through a fence, through the strands of a fence, they lean the rifle against one of the strands. And while one of the brothers is going through, the rifle goes off, pops him in the back of the head with the .22, and he dies. And his brother, because it's good time to pick grapes, while it's cool, he goes and picks his day's grapes and comes back to the house, and everybody at the house is, you know, in a panic, like, how could you go pick grapes after your brother died? And he's like, well, it was a good time to pick grapes, you know? That really impacted me. I think I read it in about 4th grade, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I remember that first Stephen King story collection and that Boogeyman story that's in there and just the power that horror, the supernatural can have over your imagination.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me that your first story was not supernatural. It was sort of about the horror of humanity.
It kind of is, yeah. But right in that same very moment, I read a story called, what's it called? I suddenly can't remember the title. Some of y'all will know this story. It was anthologized a lot in those elementary school readers. There's a boy, 10-year-old, 11-year-old. The world figures out he has precognitive like abilities. He can see what's coming a few hours, maybe a day in advance, and so he gets a television show, and the whole world depends on what he says into the camera every morning. They're waiting and waiting, and I'm probably gonna get all like teary-eyed. I always get weird when I talk about this story. One morning he wakes up, looks into the future, and he sees a comet hurtling towards Earth, and there's not a thing to be done about it. It's going to destroy everything. And he goes on television that morning, and he says, today's going to be the best day ever, you know? And he gives everybody a really good gift.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The opposite of horror.
It is, yeah. But I think people think horror is just blood and guts and terrible stuff, but there's a lot of heart in horror. There's a lot of heart to be found.
Yeah. Well, you know, I find in this adaptation of Alien that I'm doing, it's like you have the creature horror and the body horror, but a big part of that franchise for me is the moral horror of the things that people do to each other. And
no, you're totally right. There is gore. There's like viscera spilled on the wall, but there's also ethical and moral horror, and that's often a lot more disturbing and a lot longer lasting.
Well, I mean, in this new book, I was a teenage slasher. You know, obviously you're grappling with violence and in some ways humanizing the monster from the movies, you know, Jason and all that. And what was that process like for you to get inside that violence?
You know, the violence for me in horror novels, that's the easy part. I have no problem. Like, the violence is always just like a finger scratch away. It's always right under the skin. It's always been a part of who I am, how I think. So people ask me sometimes, how do you come up with such creative ways to kill people? And my answer is, I'm not going to live long enough to write down all the ways I have to kill people. You know, it's going to take a lot longer. So the violence is easy. But yeah, inhabiting, like stepping around behind the mask, that wasn't hard. But the hard part that you're probably asking about is, how did I make that killer someone the reader can identify with or engage with?
Yeah.
And that was a little bit tricky. And I was a teenage slasher really quickly because I was supposed to be writing The Angel of Indian Lake, and I thought I'll just sneak write another novel right fast. And because I had no time to prep, to research any of that stuff, I went back home to West Texas. I went back to 1989 when I was also 17, like Tully Driver, the protagonist, the slasher, and I wrote in a place that I didn't have to think about. You know, I never have to think about West Texas. It's always right there for me.
You know, what's interesting is that we remember the names of Jason and Freddy and, you know, but what was Jamie Lee Curtis's name?
Laurie Strode, yeah.
But most people don't remember that, right?
But we don't have masks of Jamie Lee Curtis. Yeah.
You know, the danger that I always face is that the villains are too likable, right? And we do in America especially, we love our villains.
I think it has a lot as far as slashers go anyways. When like something like Friday the 13th franchises out, they need a stable character to build every like kind of episode or installment around. And you do kind of end up with a Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, who we're not rooting for them because we like killers. I think us rooting for them is like, the horror is going to continue to part 7, to part 10. Maybe he'll go to space, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like, so we're not saying, yes, kill these kids, we hate these kids. We just love horror, and we're like, this means more horror.
Yeah. You know, in film, I find horror to be really interesting because it produces the biggest feeling, which is fear, for the least amount of money.
Yeah.
Because really what you're doing is engaging the audience's imagination.
Yeah.
And often what you think is in the basement is scarier than what actually is in the basement.
That's for sure. Like I tell my students, I try to train them in what I call the one-toe technique of like monsters or monstrousness, which is to say, if your character sees one toe of the baddie around the corner, they're going to build the rest of that monster, creature, person. They're going to Frankenstein it together from their own fears, like a coach they had in 7th grade, a handsy uncle they had, a bully they had, and they're going to build this monster, and it's going to be so much more terrifying than I could actually come up with.
Yeah, but then eventually you do have to produce the monster.
Generally you do, unless you're doing Bird Box or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to, and the trick is when you do finally show it head to toe in high res, you have to both give the audience what they're expecting, but also surprise them at the same time. That's a fun challenge.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, I have a teenage daughter who has loved horror movies since she was, you know, far too young to watch them officially, I feel like. And there's something to the safety of being scared in a place that you know is not dangerous.
Yeah,
right?
people talk about how horror is a roller coaster ride. You have that safety bar down. You go on the loops, you think, this is it, I'm going to die, but you're never going to fall out, actually.
Right.
And I totally understand where they're coming from, and I agree that 95% of horror is like that. Yet, at the same time, I don't know about y'all out there, but I have horror I won't engage. Like, I've never seen a Serbian film, and the reason I haven't is because I'm nervous. Like, what if it opens a door in my head that I didn't even know existed, you know? And, I mean, art is supposed to change us. We're supposed to engage art such that we come away from that experience a different person. Horror, being art, has the potential to change us. Like, Psycho made us scared of the shower, right? But I am nervous. I think some horror does not have that safety bar.
Yeah. Well, you know, I always look at Kubrick or David Lynch, right? You know, that scene in Mulholland Drive where they're in the diner and he's telling him about the dream that he had, and it's broad daylight, right? And it's like, I was in this place and behind the dumpster, right? And it's this terrifying moment in which nothing about it should be scary, right? But it's clearly tapped into something.
It clearly is, yeah. And I think you're right about the daytimeness of that scene. I think that's the prime mechanism it uses, because we're used to going to the basement, going to the dark, going to the haunted house to get scared, but this is just a random dumpster behind a diner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so when you thought about this particular idea, what was the first? Was it the slasher element? What started it for you?
You know, what started I was a teenage slasher for me probably was that scene in Nightmare on Elm Street 2 where Jesse is upstairs in his bedroom and Freddy is like coming out of him. He sticks his claw out from Jesse's midsection, and that is so wondrous to me and such a great idea, and I wanted to do something similar. I know I couldn't do the same thing because it had been done. I had to tell you the truth, I was a teenage slasher, instead of building it around another slasher, I watched 1941's The Wolfman so I could understand the necessary beats of what if you get infected with something and you transform nightly, and how is that going to endanger people around you? What are you going to care about? And that was really helpful.
And the idea came from rewatching the movie, or just that image came into your head?
Just that image.
Yeah.
That image, yeah.
And so you said you wrote that in a break while you were supposed to be writing another.
Yeah, I was supposed to. I think I started it probably in like April and finished it at the end of May, and I think my other novel was due end of July or maybe early August or something. Yeah.
Well, and you were talking to me earlier about The Simpsons, where the Stephen King is typing 2 novels at the same time. Is that that's your role model there?
That is my role model. Yeah. You know, I used to when my kids were young, like babies, and I was working 1 or 2 jobs, I'd come home at night. I couldn't get to the keyboard till about 11, and I was exhausted, and I kept waking up with like 42 pages of the letter N, which, I mean, that's some kind of novel. It's not the kind of novel I wanted to write. And I found out that what I could do to make myself stay awake was I could get modeling clay and put it all around my keyboard and get all my knives and open them and stick them in the modeling clay blade up. And so if I laid down, I would die, And so that keeps you awake really well,
And that you tell your students to do. Yeah.
I tell them to be safe, but telling truth, telling writers to be safe is pretty useless because safety is overrated, I think.
So a part of that memory in Midland was sitting there with your brother.
It was,
and
yeah.
What did he end up doing?
He builds trucks. He's always got trucks in the magazines.
And does he read your books? Is he still a reader?
I think he listened to Growing Up Dead in Texas. He called me one day and said, "Hey, man, I'm listening to your novel." And I was like, "Great." Never heard from him again for like 4 months.
Right. Okay. Liked it, didn't like it.
Yeah.
Not everything's for everybody.
No, he's in it too. So
yeah.
He's on the cover actually. He's on the cover with me.
Really?
With one of that book. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, when did you start writing your own?
When I started writing, in high school, I wrote these long, like 6-page things that I would fold 3 times and leave under girls' windshield wipers. And they were like so thinly veiled, like metaphor. It was just terrible, like 2 swans on a lake and their necks intertwine and look, they love each other. But it was all like pragmatic. It was so I could go out with this girl, And I think that's a good use for fiction. One of them found me on some social media a few years ago, and she said, "Hey, I've still got all your letters," and I was just like, unfriend.
Yeah.
But I started writing when I was 19. I was sitting in the back of a room like this, except for about 3 times as big. I was taking a monster lit course at Texas Tech University, which I'd signed up for because the advisor said it's a monster lit course. And I got there, and I thought it was going to be vampires and werewolves. Monster meant size. It was like 400 people. And so I was like, I'm in the back taking notes on Dante or Chaucer or something. I had a spiral and a pen with me. That's all. A couple of police officers come in, and they lower their glasses, and they start casing the joint. And I'm going lower and lower in my seat because my whole life, anytime the police walk in the room, it's always for me. And sure enough, it was for me. They drag me up, or they pull me out. And instead of offering up excuses for whatever I had done, the previous weekend, I just stayed silent. And they weren't there because I was in trouble. They were there because one of my uncles, who was 2 hours away, had been terribly, terribly burned, and they had airlifted him to the burn unit of the town I was in because it was the best in the region, and they couldn't find any family members. They only found me. So they took me to that burn unit ICU, and I sat there for 3 days waiting for him to live or die, and I just had that spiral and that pen. I got bored. I wrote my first story, a ghost story, and then I came back to my Composition 2 classroom on Monday after missing Wednesday and Friday, and I had not written the personal essay I was supposed to write, so I just tore those pages out of my notebook, folded them at the top, put them on the stack with everybody else's. Everybody else's was typed. I didn't have a word processor or a typewriter, and this instructor had no reason to read this handwritten thing that was not on assignment, but she did, and she passed it on to the creative writing faculty, who liked it enough that they typed it up for me and entered it into a contest, which I won. And I got a $50 check, and that was the first time I ever turned lies into groceries. And that was the most amazing transmutation. And I just kept doing it. I kept publishing in little journals, getting $50 checks for awards. And I wouldn't be a writer today if that instructor had not considered my off-topic story. It's so lucky.
Yeah. 30 books.
Probably 35.
35 books. Because there's some in a drawer somewhere, or they're just 5 that haven't come out yet?
No, I've got a lot in a drawer. Like, people always ask me, how many books have you written, which is a weird question, because I've probably written 50 novels, but only, as far as books, I think I've published 35, 37, but that counts comic books, it counts novellas, so maybe you're right, maybe it's 30.
Yeah. Did MFA? No MFA?
I didn't get an MFA. I got an MA and a PhD.
Okay. But you just started writing to own and owned that identity as a writer without.
Oh yeah, yeah. When I first came to my master's program, all us, my cohort of incoming graduate students, we were like those. What do they call them? And SpongeBob, those are they the nematodes that come to Krusty Krab and they just like hop around and they want to eat everything. They were like water locusts. We were like that, and we were saying, when can we publish? When can we publish? When can we submit? The professors kept saying, calm down, slow your roll. We'll tell you when you're good enough to submit. And I just shrugged and said, I'll find out if I'm good enough to submit. So I started submitting and started getting published, and I didn't need permission. And that's probably, if I have one thing I would love to impart to new writers, it's that. It's don't wait for the world to give you permission. Don't wait for them to ask you for your stuff. Just keep writing it, and maybe it'll happen, you know?
Yeah, I think the challenge in MFA programs is you can't help but have a kind of group think.
Yeah.
About what's good writing and what's not, and if you're the surrealist in the group, people aren't gonna encourage you in the way that
if you're not doing Raymond Carver, Alice Munro kind of stuff. Yeah.
And so, where you teach, do you feel like the odd man out, or?
I am the only genre writer on faculty. We have 7, creative writing professors, but my school and my program are both really supportive of my genre output. They don't seem embarrassed by it, which is really nice. The former place I taught, I remember I saw another professor in the hall. I just published a novel called Demon Theory, and he said, I read that new novel of yours, and he said, yeah, it was kind of fun, but when are you going to get back to writing serious stuff, And that's kind of the prevailing attitude you hear in most like ivory tower situations, of course, but it's changing, man. Used to, in my creative writing workshops, probably the first 8 years of teaching from 2000 to 2008, maybe 2009, I would put on my syllabus, in here you're going to write one genre piece. Maybe it's going to be a princess, maybe it's going to be a pirate, maybe it's going to be an alien, zombies, whatever, one genre piece. And hands would go up, and they'd say, seriously? And I'd say, seriously. And I would always have about 3 people stand up and walk out like a protest, But then, long about 09, maybe 10, every student coming in the classroom was only writing genre. I stopped having to put that on my syllabus. I hardly ever get literary stories anymore. And it could be because people know I'm the genre guy. Maybe they come to me. I'm not sure about that, but I like it.
I like that the 3 people who wanted to be mid-list literary fiction writers got up and walked out.
It's a noble protest, man.
Yeah. And so you said you only get 30 minutes. Like, is it because your student work takes so much of your time?
No, it's just that I'm easily distractible, I think. Being a professor does take some time, but no, it's not like digging ditches or something. It's like I can. If I were better with my own time, more responsible or something, I think I would have more time to write. But I'm also not one of those writers who writes on a schedule. I just kind of, do y'all remember when Goblet of Fire came out and you'd walk through downtown here and you'd see people reading it on the sidewalk, reading it in line at the bank, reading it in their lap at a stoplight? That's how I like to write. I like to fill my day with writing. So that's why I'm always wedging it in here and there.
Yeah. How did you feel about the success of Only Dead Indian?
Oh, the Only Good Indians.
The Only Good Indian, yeah. Out of your collection of why that one.
Why that? I don't. Who knows why that connected? But it's a weird novel. Maybe that's why it connected. Because I didn't write it as a novel. I wrote it because I had a novella due to someone, and I sat down because. One of my first novellas, Mapping the Interior, took 4 days to write. And so somebody called me and said, hey, give me a novella. I figured I got 4 days. So I sat down and wrote for 4 weeks and had a novel. And I was like, well, I overshot that. So I pushed it to the side and sat down to write a novella. And I wrote another stupid novel. And so I pushed it to the side. and then I told myself, dude, you gotta do this. And so I gave myself a limit, 115 pages. And I wrote 115 pages. I found a sort of ending. And it worked. It was a novella. And then I accidentally thought of one more line that would make it metastasize into a novel, and I tried to not think of it, but it was already too late. And so I called my agent up and I said, hey, I just wrote this thing. I can turn it in as a novella, or I can do it as a novel. What do you want? And she didn't even hesitate. She said, you know what, novels are easier to sell. Go ahead and write it into a novel. And so I finished The Only Good Indians. I turned it from a novella into a novel, and I think my suspicion is that's why that book hit, because it's a really weird novel. It's not shaped like a novel should be shaped.
Yeah, and it's the story of these four friends, right, who went on an elk hunt.
Yep, they sneak into the elder section, which you're not supposed to be in. They massacre a herd of elk, which is more meat than they need or can take. And then 10 years later, something from that day is stalking them. The hunters are becoming the hunted.
Yeah. And how much do you find that you're, because the sort of monster in that, right, is it comes out of native mythology.
Well, not really. People always want to say that like deer woman and elk head woman are kind of the same, but to me they're not. What happened was I was at some banquet in LA where they kind of tell you where to sit, and I got seated by this entertainment lawyer, and I was like, hey, this is my chance, you know? And so for like 20 minutes, I pitched him my idea to write a Three's Company novel, because I could do Jack and Chrissy and Janet like nobody could, I think. And he kept telling me in every way he could that I could not do this. And I finally shrugged and ate some more of my gross chicken. And I said, how about I write a Jason Voorhees novel then, Friday the 13th novel? And he said, same thing. But we still went through it for 20 minutes, you know, of me arguing. And I left with him, have never given me any loophole to write a Friday the 13th novel. But I thought, you know, I can still do it. All I got to do is not use the hockey mask. And that's why Elkhead Woman has an elk head. It's because I couldn't use a hockey mask.
We always think that, you know, the reader theories are always so fascinating to writers because often the inspiration is so uninteresting in a way. But
it is. So many of my things I write come from, I'm standing in line at Burger King to get my triple Whopper with ketchup only, and I'll hear somebody call a person going out to the parking lot, hey, get my duck from the toolbox. And I know I misheard that because you don't keep ducks in toolboxes, but at the same time, suddenly getting bigger and bigger in my head is a world where everybody walks around with a duck in their toolbox, you know? And then I'm writing the Duck Toolbox novel.
The key is not to edit yourself before the genius comes out.
Yeah.